Yung tatay ko, sinabi mo ba sa kanya na
Oo, pero hindi siya naniwala. Kasi ang
hindi
mga
siya naniwala
oo,
na
ang mga
buntis ka?
kaibigan daw niya, ang mga kaibigan daw sabi niya gano'n, gawain daw 'yan ng mga Pilipina kahit hindi ikaw nakabuntis. Sasabihin ikaw nakabuntis kasi ano ka, yung Navy ka, hinabol nila yung yung sahod mo, gano'n, gano'n, gano'n. Hindi siya nagsustento sa'yo kahit isang kusing, wala. Kasi nga parang inabandona ka na niya.
Hi, I'm Eric Pito, and this is Asian American Studies 353, Filipino and Filipino American Identities. In the beginning of the semester, we started our entire discussion on the complexity of Filipino American identities by highlighting the peculiar position of Filipino Americans in Hawaii, who were recruited originally as exploited laborers, but later joined other communities who settled permanently in Hawaii, as Dean Serenio described them, as settler colonizers. It was important for me to start this class this way because even though I'm teaching a class about Filipino and Filipino American identities, I don't want to contribute to the historical erasure of American empire, both here and abroad. In most Filipino American history classes, for example, we often focus, and for a lot of valid reasons, on the marginalization that Filipinos experience throughout their history here in America. After all, it's a class about Filipino and Filipino Americans. So why wouldn't we? And so most books about Filipino Americans, workshops on this topic, as well as the classes, they all begin with the Philippine-American War and American colonialism in order to explain the origin of that marginalization. So war and colonization, it's the starting point for how most people learn about Filipino Americans. But there's something crucial that we miss when we center the narrative of Filipino American history this way. And Filipinos in Hawaii, they hint at this blind spot. You see, the subject of Filipinos in Hawaii, it really complicates this narrative of marginalization and oppression, namely because Filipinos who historically settled in Hawaii as immigrant laborers, they were exploited by agricultural corporations, and their bodies did suffer immensely from the harsh working environments that they endured. But for those who stayed in Hawaii, their children and grandchildren continue till today to benefit from America's subjugation of native communities in Hawaii and the institutionalized erasure of those who continue to hope for independence from American governance there today. See, being American, it's really complicated in that way. And so this is the case with us Filipinos here on the mainland too, and every American who isn't native to this country. Most of us in this class were entitled to aspire to better lives here in America. We wrestle sometimes with our own experiences of being outsiders to dominant society in different ways. But you see, we aren't forced every day to fully come to terms with how these aspirations are only made possible by the continual erasure of Native communities here on the mainland and throughout the Bay Area. As I'm recording this, for example, most people around me just celebrated Thanksgiving. This erasure, it's a real thing. Well, because of this powerful idea of America, this erasure, it happens in a lot of ways, and it moves in many directions, transnationally even. And at the basis of this erasure, and has always been, the force of American militarism, both here and abroad. Native Hawaiians continue to be dislocated from their fundamental birthright to their land. This is the very same notion of birthright that all American citizens get to enjoy. But the thing is, we don't tend to think about the fact that these rights come in direct conflict with the original rights of Native Americans who were here before all of us. Going back to the American military and this topic of erasure, this week I want to complete the transnational circle of our discussion on Filipino American identities by bringing our attention to American militarization. You see, American militarization, it's inextricable from the history of Filipino Americans. And it's been one of those continuous threads weaving together lots of the ideas that I've been discussing this semester. Throughout this semester, I purposefully tried to move back and forth each week, not only between the past and the present chronologically, but geographically as well. Whenever I talk about Filipinos in the U.S., I've also been talking about Filipinos in the Philippines, and vice versa. This back and forth, this is what I mean when I say that transnational, this concept, it doesn't simply describe the movement of people or money or things between places. It happens in a lot of ways. It happens with ideas, dreams, memories, and even forgetting. And that's why I started this semester by talking about Native Hawaiians, and I'm doing the same thing today. I want to end the semester again by starting my lecture with talking about Native Hawaiians so that I can continue highlighting this thread. The thread linking Filipinos here with Native Americans and African Americans, and Hawaiians in Hawaii all the way back to the Philippines. And yes, one of those threads is the history of American militarization. And one of the literal byproducts of this militarized circulation provides the central topic for today's class. Today I want to talk about the so-called Filipino Amerasians in the Philippines. I want to finish our discussion this semester on this topic because Filipino Amerasians are really the truly forgotten Asian Americans. Even though writers continue to ascribe the title of forgotten or invisible to all Filipino Americans, well, I have to respectfully disagree. Filipino Americans are neither invisible nor forgotten. Sure, most people don't discuss the significance of Filipino Americans in American history or dominant culture. And yes, Americans and America as a whole does actively try to forget the Philippine-American War. But they don't do the same thing with Filipino Americans as a community. Lack of attention is different than forgetting. Forgetting is a mental process that one does continuously, sometimes daily. The anthropologist Ann Stoller calls this aphasia, or more specifically, colonial aphasia, because it's not only a kind of cultural blockage, how we as a society just don't think about something, but it's also an active disassociation. And America has actively chosen to forget its obligation to Amerasians, a community of actual Americans living in the Philippines. Their claim to American citizenship, their birthright to move to and live here if they want to, have all been completely erased to the point that most Americans, including Filipino Americans, have no idea that they exist. If it feels like I'm especially worked up today, it's because it's impossible to understand the actual predicament that Filipino Amerasians continue to endure today without sharing with you just how intense the contradictions are within this idea of America. These contradictions are frustrating to think about, but they do explain why Filipino Amerasians, most of them, can never rejoin their families here in America. Native Americans and Hawaiians, they're forced to live with these contradictions on a really fundamental level, every day. It's not abstract like colonialism is for most Filipino Americans. These contradictions for Native Americans, Hawaiians, they're very real. And without grounding ourselves in this context, the contradictions and erasure that are produced because of the idea of America, that same idea that writers all the way back to Carlos Bulasan and W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about, it would be impossible to understand. Why? Why is it so hard for America to address the enormous injustice done to Filipino Amerasians? It can't be described as anything else than this active forgetting, aphasia, and erasure. Now, if you can, just stop and think about this question for a moment. If the power of the American dream is so appealing, so much so that thousands of Filipinos still today, every year, and people all over the world continue to make their way to this country, no matter how hard, regardless of the cost to themselves and their families. What about Amerasians in the Philippines? Why can't they, most of them, aspire to this same dream? Why isn't this entire community entitled to pursue and enjoy the same idea of America? Why aren't they allowed to come here, rejoin their families, and live in the United States? Given the fact that they're, American. Well, the thing is, most Filipino Amerasians, those who remained in the Philippines, they aren't Amerasian actually, legally speaking. Just bear with me while I explain. Many members of this community, they might qualify for American citizenship through their American parent, but not because they're Amerasian. I'll explain. Amerasians aren't simply children of mixed nationality. Filipino Amerasians, for example, they're not just American and Filipino. Amerasians are a very specific community. It was the famous American author and philanthropist Pearl S. Buck who coined the term Amerasian. And when she used this term to describe mixed-race children, she wanted to bring the public's attention to those children who were born directly because of the U.S. military and who were abandoned, left behind, throughout military bases in Asia. In her novel, East Wind, West Wind, published all the way back in 1930, she provided the original frame for how Americans would view Amerasians across the region. While she was originally referring to Amerasians left in China, remember, this is 1930. Her words in an interview later were really telling. She said, "I am compelled to the conclusion that the most needy children in the world are those born in Asia, whose mothers are Asian, but whose fathers are American. They are a new group of human beings, a group that Asians do not know how to deal with, illegitimate as well as mixed in race. Our present project, therefore, is the Amerasian." There's a lot to work through this quote, but let's focus on this part here. There are a new group of human beings, a group that Asians don't know how to deal with, illegitimate as well as mixed in race. Notice this word illegitimate. According to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, the USCIS, the U.S. government agency where American parents send their requests to legally reunite with their foreign-born Amerasian children. An Amerasian is a child who was fathered by U.S. military personnel during the Korean and Vietnam Wars to Asian nationals. The first thing that's important for me to emphasize is the fact that Amerasians don't only exist in the Philippines. While the USCIS's definition broadly categorizes Amerasians as children fathered during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, keep in mind that the U.S. military has hundreds of bases throughout the Asian Pacific region now. But during those wars, there were many, many more bases spread all throughout Asia. So there are Amerasian communities in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. But they're also in Japan and Okinawa. It's not just in the Philippines. Anywhere in Asia where there's U.S. military bases, there are Amerasians. However, the U.S. government only legally recognizes a few of these countries. I'll get to that later. The second thing that I want to bring to your attention to in Buck's quote is this part here. Those born in Asia whose mothers are Asian, but whose fathers are American. You see, it's entirely normalized to assume that Amerasians are fathered by an American man and mothered by a Filipino woman, because the term immediately conjures the intersection between militarism and sex work.
Subic Bay, the Philippines, was a sexual playground where American sailors and GIs could buy themselves a so-called entertainment girl for under $10.
The discussion about Amerasians is highly gendered. What I mean by that is that spoken or unspoken, narratives about Amerasians presume that it was a Filipino mother who was left behind by an American father. It's actually explicitly stated, not only in the USCIS's definition that I just described, but also in the Amerasian Foundation and Amerasian Family Finders definitions. These are the official organizations tasked with the responsibility of searching for and reuniting Amerasians with their fathers here in the U.S. They define an Amerasian as any person who was fathered by a citizen of the United States and whose mother is or was an Asian national. But that's not always the case. Amerasians aren't always children born of an American father and Filipino mother.
Negro po siya. Bustisong negro. Mama ko po nag-asawa lang iba tapos pinabayaan kami. Pag gutom na gutom po kami, namamalimas-malimas po kami.
Itong ganito yun, pinanganak ako 46. Pero wala pang gano'n itong bahay dito. Masyado, wala pang gano'n dito. Yung nakikita ko na yung marami ng kano dito. Nakikitarbaho-tarbaho ako sa mga kwab. May kumukuha sa akin. Yung gera, yung bang kung tawagin ay pinag-iwanan ng pier. Yung nanay ko, Pilipina. Yung kasi kung yun naman yan, talagang kala nila, Amerikano. Tayo malaki.
Because of the ideas attached to Amerasians, we don't even allow ourselves to imagine that there are multiple generations of Amerasians who have been left to fend for themselves in the Philippines. And this leads to the third important point that I need to bring up about this community. The idea of who Amerasians are is inherently linked not only to American militarism, but all the negative ideas that almost every society around the world, including in America and Asia, have when it comes to sex work and prostitution. I can't state this any more clearly. Amerasians are the embodiment of the stigma around sex work. It's not a stigma that's solely based on false prejudice, however.
By the time U.S. bases closed here in 1992, at least 50,000 children are believed to have been born to U.S. fathers. Some of them left behind by mothers who were either unable to bear the social stigma or were just too poor to support them.
It's estimated that 23,000 to 52,000 Amerasian children were born in the Philippines alone. And there is a lot of evidence that points to the fact that many of the mothers of those children did work in labor that was directly or indirectly involved with the sex work industry around American bases. The documentary that I've been showing throughout this lecture already, Left by the Ship, it's one of the few documentaries made that focuses on the topic of Amerasians. It captures the experiences of 3 Filipino Amerasians who were abandoned by their American fathers and a Filipino mother, and they were all stationed in Olongapo City.
This was a fishing village that became a brothel.
Thousands of fatherless Amerasians, the offspring of Filipino women and U.S. military men, were left behind.
It would not have happened unless there was a U.S. military base in this village.
The American law, known as the Amerasian Act, permits Amerasian children from other countries to become citizens of the United States. But Filipino Amerasians are not included. They alone must be claimed by their American fathers.
When you close your eyes, can you still go back to that place a world away from where you are now? Or have you forgotten Olongapo City?
Subic Bay Naval Base in the Philippines, which is located in Olongapo, was the largest naval base outside of the United States mainland until 1992. And Olongapo City, just outside of its gates, didn't exist until the base did. Its economy was built on providing services to soldiers back then. When the base was still open, more than 15,000 women worked in its red light district. 15,000. Filipino Amerasians embody the stigma of being viewed as what Pearl S. Buck said, illegitimate children, because people assume that they were raised by a single mother. And this stigma is further deepened by the belief that their mother became pregnant while she was doing sex work. So this intersection, American militarism and colonialism, it's the reason why Amerasians are often labeled iniwan ng barko, or left by the ship. But this stigma, it's really complicated. Part of it is based in reality, and some of it not so much. According to Peter Kuchera, one of the most outspoken advocates for Filipino Amerasians, and a prolific writer on this topic, many of the Amerasians that he and his co-researchers interviewed, what they learned was not all Amerasians were born simply out of an exchange of services or because of business transactions. Many of their interviewees expressed that their parents were in love, in relationships, and some were even married for a period. But many more Amerasians do fall into this stereotype of being children of sex workers. And so what makes this stigma more complicated is that it's not simply a shame built around sex work, but it's mixed together with deeply held beliefs around sexual purity, the proper role of women in the Philippines, and really complicated views about American men. All of these things are intersecting together with the shame of having a child outside of wedlock. Illegitimate. This is a shame that still exists in many parts of America, but much more so in the Philippines.
Meron nang nasagot sa ano mo, yung feedback na nga.
Yung sa'yo. Anong naging epekto sa'yo?
Ay gumaanggaan ng maganda.
Anong naging epekto sa'yo na meron kang anak na illegitimate?
Sa Philippine law, hindi ka makakapagturo if you are out of wedlock, hindi ka kasal. Kasi immorality daw yon. Immorality.
And the worst part is that none of these children made any of these choices. Filipino Amerasians painstakingly represent this shame and embody this complicated stigma. But what's not interrogated when it comes to these discussions about Amerasians, and specifically their mothers, is the profound imbalance between these women and American servicemen. The women who engage in intimate relationships with men on these American bases, they're intensely racialized by Americans. They have very few resources and are themselves having to constantly carry the weight of these expectations and stigmas on their shoulders.
Ang barko nila noon ay USS Carbinsunte. Galing ako ng probinsya sa Katbalugan sa 14 years old ako noon.
raising their children usually with little to no support from their children's American fathers. And the fourth and last thing that I need to emphasize in this lecture is that I'm really centering this discussion on one particular group of Amerasians in the Philippines, and that's Black Filipino Amerasians. Filipino Amerasians who were born of a Black father, they experience a kind of alienation in Philippine society that's really different than those who were fathered by a white man.
Nag-elementary ako. Grade 5 siguro, mga 10 years old o 12. Doon ako nag-umpisa nagkaroon ng trouble. Nanuntok ako ng klase ko kasi nga sa saltanan.
Anong sabi niya sa'yo?
Ita, negro, taga-bundok. Siyempre masakit sa akin yun, negro. Tawagin mo na akong lahat, wag lang negro. Pero nasanay na ako, iba naman.
Paano
iba naman?
Iba naman?
Nga, family problem ako. Ikaw nga, pamilya mo, ganito, ganun. Sabi ko, nangihimasok ka nang di mo ano. Siyempre nanay ko pa rin. No choice ako. Nanggap ko. Nasa yun na nangyari, ganito.
This is an especially sensitive topic. Not the fact that Black Filipino Amerasians do experience an especially difficult time growing up in the Philippines, but writers who talk about this differentiation in treatment, they have to tiptoe around the reality that all mixed-race Caucasian Filipinos, Amerasian or not, are treated differently in Philippine society because of their lighter skin and white features. The stigma around being Black in the Philippines is an overwhelming topic to discuss, and the handful of studies that are conducted on the Filipino Amerasian community, they all emphasize how Black Filipino Amerasians experience much higher rates of abuse from Philippine society. And it's not just the children. Filipino mothers of Black Amerasian children, they experience this too.
Yung iba, umuwi na sila sa probinsya nila. Yung iba na walang Amerasian, hindi tinatanggap ng pamilya nila yung may anak silang Amerasian, lalo na pag Black American.
Victoria Reyes, an Amerasian sociologist who wrote a book about many of the mothers who worked around American bases in the Philippines, she writes about the power of this racial stigma. Corazon, who has one Amerasian daughter and 2 Filipino children, met Hugh, a Black American, in 1977. They dated or married, and Corazon experienced a double stigma, perceptions of prostitution and judgments that her relations were with a Black, not white American. She encountered people who questioned her choices. Why not white? Why did you mess up with a Black American? Since her Amerasian daughter is light-skinned, people also question her daughter's paternity. The power of this complicated and immensely painful stigma is so intense. It impacts so many of the identities of Amerasians. For so many of those mothers of Amerasians, and a lot of the Amerasians themselves, the military base, it embodied this idea of America. If the U.S. represents the land of unlimited opportunity for so many Filipinos, well, American bases were as close to America as they could ever dream of getting. Just imagine it. For those women who grew up near bases or relocated to be near them for work, there's this massive contrast between the poverty of their lives, a poverty that most of us here can never imagine, and the vast wealth that the imposing U.S. military ships and bases represented. A lot of people all over the world still today aspire to the idea of America. Keep in mind that all of these illicit exchanges, not just sex, but all sorts of material goods and services, they're not only condoned by the U.S. military, but institutionalized around the bases. Isn't it fair to say that these women, men, and trans Filipinos who provided services to the U.S. military and still do today, well, if they had a chance to reach for that same idea, shouldn't they be fully entitled to do that? Why aren't these mothers able to aspire to that America that they imagine. Another amazing colleague and friend of mine who also passed away recently, Sujay Gage, she explained that this contradiction and erasure, it illustrates how the idea of America has always been attached to specific ideas about who American women should be. Sujay wrote, "Many countries that housed U.S. military installations did not consider the possibility of mixed U.S. Americans born as a result of this presence, creating a complicated relationship between all parties involved, but more specifically between the women and the state. The notions of our women as vessels of the nation state or mothers of the citizens of the nation state responsible for the health of the nation are violated in this regard. The women who violated the laws of state membership by willingly or unwillingly having liaisons with foreign non-Asian men are no longer considered full-fledged members of the state. This national insecurity is then extended to their children." And so even before the Vietnam War, when U.S. Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, this legislation, which aimed to provide homes for children who were fathered by American soldiers during World War II, mothers weren't allowed to repatriate to the U.S. with their children. Instead, they were encouraged to give up their children for adoption. Furthermore, the act was intended to provide homes to children fathered mainly during the European campaign. Those who were fathered in Asia, however, in places like Japan and South Korea, Amerasians, they were more reluctantly received by adoption agencies and parents here in America. Just like Margarita's father in the documentary described, the story of Amerasians spans much longer than we tend to think. It goes all the way back to World War II, to the 1930s, when Pearl Buck first brought up Amerasians to the American public, and even further back to that moment Americans began invading the archipelago in 1898. Renato Rosaldo, who you already know, he describes a very peculiar reality that's often produced by the history of colonialism. He tries to describe why it is that imperialist nations, long after they've laid waste to countries and people that they invaded, recount about their experiences in those countries in really strange ways, almost romanticizing what was in reality a brutal cruelty. He called this an imperialist nostalgia. He says, "My concern thus resides with a particular kind of nostalgia, often found under imperialism, where people mourn the passing of what they themselves have transformed. Imperialist nostalgia thus revolves around a paradox. A person kills somebody and then mourns his or her victim. In more attenuated form, someone deliberately alters a form of life and then regrets that things have not remained as they were prior to his or her intervention. This kind of nostalgia is what allows countries like America to imagine itself as a savior, when in reality, it's the reason why the country was devastated in the first place. So in 1982, long after the end of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the U.S. government finally tried to come to terms with its impact in Southeast Asia by once again focusing on the children who were left behind by American soldiers. But like it did in 1948, the policies enacted by the U.S. government to address the problem of Amerasians were very patriarchal. In 1982, the U.S. Congress passed the Amerasian Act, which allowed some children of U.S. service members born in other countries to apply for U.S. visas. Some children. The act gave preferential immigration to children from Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. However, Amerasians from Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines were all excluded from the law, and there was no explanation that was ever given for this. And that's the reason why so many of the children who were born to U.S. service members in the Philippines weren't eligible to apply for citizenship as Amerasians. Furthermore, many Amerasian children throughout all of the countries that were eligible under the law, many of them didn't even know who their fathers were. And if they did, often the fathers were unwilling or unable to support their petitions for U.S. citizenship. So as a result, Amerasians in the Philippines were left without a clear path to citizenship, social services, or economic mobility. This is what I mean when I say that Filipino Amerasians aren't technically Amerasian, certainly not to the U.S. military, and not to the U.S. citizenship and immigration. They might have been able to make their way to the U.S., but that decision still completely fell on their American parent. To claim U.S. citizenship, just like anyone born to an American abroad, a Filipino Amerasian would need their father to certify his parentage before the child turned 18.
Okay. I have something here for you. Now please read what is on the bottom.
This lots of luck if you're already 18.
A child is born, all right? If he hasn't become a citizen by his 18th birthday, okay, his father don't want it.
Yeah.
Okay, it's the father's responsibility, and he just never got around to making you a citizen, which is a shame, you know? And that's his fault. I mean, that's your heritage. That's his right. That's why they call it a birthright. His father was an American. That means he's an American.
A few succeeded, obviously, but most Amerasians, they weren't able to track down their estranged fathers. And when they did, a lot of them were rejected by their biological fathers. The 1982 law gave a lot of Amerasians hope that they might one day make a new life for themselves in America, away from the poverty and social discrimination in the Philippines. But the age deadline, it had long passed. So the pathway, it would have been much easier if the U.S. government did see Filipino Amerasians as Amerasians. If they were legally recognized as Amerasians, there would be no deadline to apply. They can be well past the age of 18, and most are. You see, the program, the Amerasian Act that created this program, it still remains open today. But unfortunately for Filipino Amerasians, this door, it's been shut for a lot of them for a long time. The Act excludes Filipinos, and it includes, for no reason, just 5 countries: Cambodia, Laos, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. To be fair, there were a lot of efforts in Congress to rectify the omission. Philippine-based organizations, the ones that provided services and advocacy for Amerasians, they took the lead in filing complaints before Congress.
Iba nung pag-alis ng base, 1992, nag-ano kami na suportahan ng mga Amerikano ang mga Amerasian. File kami ng class suit. Nung lumabas yung resulta noong 1994 na hindi, yun nga, dinismiss yung kaso.
Bakit? Anong
kasi
reason?
Nga, yun nga, walang, hindi daw sagutin ng gobyerno yan kasi sa individual American yan. Kasi ang prostitution sa Pilipinas ay illegal, hindi naman legal.
So, ibig ba nilang sabihin, pag ginawang legal yung prostitution, sasagutin na nila?
Sasabihin nila, wala kaming katibayan para i-force talaga. Tapos hindi daw nila responsibilidad yun.
And from 1997 to 2001, the late Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, he tried to introduce an amendment to the Immigration Act to include Japan and the Philippines. But the Senate Judiciary Committee blocked all of these attempts. For them, Filipino Amerasians weren't victims of discrimination. They were conceived from illicit affairs and prostitution. And they felt that unlike Amerasians in South Korea or Vietnam, Filipino Amerasians were born during peacetime, away from war zones. In a response to Senator Inouye, the Judiciary Committee rejected the amendment, saying, Amerasians in the Philippines and Japan are not subject to discrimination, prejudice, or hatred. The mothers were prostitutes, and these countries were not war zones. This is how stigma becomes structural and institutionalized. These assumptions in the morality or immorality tied to how people view not even the Amerasian children themselves, but their mothers, has led to over 50,000 children being born of American parents and are therefore American, to be left behind and forgotten in the Philippines. Catherine Moon, who also writes about militarized sex work around American bases in South Korea, from her interviews, she describes how American men who sought out sexual intimacy with local Korean women, they simply viewed these experiences as temporary excursions, and more significantly, as a natural part of what just happens in the military.
Anytime there's any military presence stationed at one point, they are human beings. They're going to get their biological urges. Children get left behind.
These men never imagined themselves as fathers. So the U.S. military, it takes on a similar perspective. It enjoys the authority it has in each of the countries it occupies, but it desires none of the responsibility it has to the people who live in those countries, which is really ironic. In 1993, a federal class action was filed against the U.S. government on behalf of 8,000 abandoned Amerasian children and their mothers. It sought $68.8 million for child support based on the claim that these mothers had an implied contract with American servicemen, assuring them and their children financial and physical security in return for the role that they played in local entertainment industries around the bases. In the complaint, it says when the base was closed, negotiations were begun to obtain funds to clean up toxic damage to the local land of the former naval preserve. But nothing is being done to relieve the human damage which was done to those who were left behind, namely the thousands of forgotten children of American servicemen. Children who, it alleged, were spawned by a system fostered for nearly 5 decades by U.S. Navy policies.
American Court of Claims did not actually rule on the issue. The defense invoked the right of the U.S. Not to be sued under state immunity from suit provision.
Ultimately, however, according to the judge's unpublished opinion, later obtained by Time magazine, the Navy moved for and won a dismissal on the grounds that no such agreement was ever established, and that even if there was one, because it involved paying for sexual services, it would have been illegal, and thus unenforceable by the courts. An agency did obtain some money. It worked out an informal settlement since the case was involuntarily dismissed. That agency received a U.S. aid grant of $650,000 provided to another foundation that was taking care of some 3,500 Filipino Amerasians. While it's not nothing, it amounted to just about $180 to use for each of those children, compared to the $8,000 per child that the lawsuit was originally seeking for more than twice as many Amerasians.
We were supporting the idea of support from America for the children, and they came up with a very, very small sum.
Did nobody else take up this cause and
No.
initiate another campaign?
Nothing at all.
Nothing.
While some Amerasians were able to make their way to the U.S., the majority remained in the Philippines. In the years following the closure of the U.S. military bases in the Philippines in 1992, the situation for many Amerasians didn't improve significantly. The physical basis, they were no longer around to provide primary sources of economic activity or opportunity for the Amerasian community. And the U.S., it still maintains a military presence in the region through their visiting forces and other arrangements. The social and economic impact on Amerasian children in the Philippines, it's severe. For many of them, life is marked by poverty, neglect, and discrimination. And without the financial support or recognition of their American parents, these children are often raised by their mothers who struggle to provide for them. And so, many of those mothers work in low-wage jobs, including in the service and sex labor sector, and they have limited access to healthcare and education. And for Amerasian children, they're often attending severely under-resourced public schools, where especially the Black Filipino Amerasians, they're subjected to bullying and teasing for their mixed and racial heritage. The intense stigma connected to Amerasians makes them a symbol of the historical exploitation of Filipino women by the U.S. and people from other nations. In this class, we've talked a lot about the intrinsic heterogeneity of identity and identities. In a country that was formed through an immense heterogeneity of cultures and nationalities, it's almost unthinkable that Amerasians can be so ostracized and treated as second-class citizens in the Philippines. But the thing is, it isn't hard to imagine. We can think about it. The assumptions that we make about Amerasians, about darker-skinned Filipinos in general, and the forgetting and erasure about how these communities, both here in the mainland and throughout the American Empire, it allows us to actively forget about Amerasians. And that's just not an idea that I want to be a part of or contribute to, and I don't want to forget it.